breakdown of the weapons of mass destruction that was in Iraq that ended up not being there. And the question is, are we getting better information or the same kind of misinformation that would rush us into a confrontation with Iran, rush us into a confrontation with Afghanistan, and are we just shifting the battlefield of engagement from Iraq to Iran or Afghanistan when we ought to be retreating back? That's one of the first real global issues that the president has to deal with, and deal with it under the critical eye of many that supported him. Now, I might say in passing, I was one that never bought the justification that was used for the war in Iraq. I just couldn't buy the logic or lack of logic behind going into Iraq after 9/11. I realize I'm in Texas, and I know this is George Bush's home state. But it never made sense to me that if we were attacked by bin Laden, why were we going after Saddam Hussein? If in fact bin Laden was behind one of the most despicable acts in history, certainly the most severely damaging terrorist attack on these shores, then it would seem to me that bin Laden would have been the logical target of the United States response. Now, I didn't get that going to college. I got that growing up in the hood. I grew up in the hood in Brooklyn, New York. And if anyone familiar with the hood, we have crime problems. And every once in a while, you would have your house broken in. I never heard of somebody breaking in my house. I call the police, and the police come, and I tell them, let's go get the guy that insulted my daddy 20 years ago. So that was the illogic of Hussein. Then what I couldn't buy is with all of the kind of inferences that Secretary Powell and others working for then President Bush would make, they could not give us any clear evidence of these so-called weapons of mass destruction. I remember growing up in the early 60s. I was still in elementary school. And there was what was called at the time the Cuban Missile Crisis. And there, off from the ports of Havana, Russians had put these tanks that had missiles that would be a threat to America. And I'll never forget as a kid, then UN Ambassador Adlai Stevenson stood up in the United Nations and showed these actual photographs of these missiles there in Havana, and how then President Kennedy said that Khrushchev and Fidel Castro had moved those missiles. Now this was 60, 61, in the time when we barely had instamatic cameras. Yet we had the capacity to get pictures of missiles in Cuba. Doesn't make sense to me that in 2002, given the technology that we had grown in those 40 years, where we had cameras that could shoot miles down through walls, up the stairs, down and people's satellites up in the air 24 hours a day, yet we couldn't get one picture of one weapon of mass destruction. That was a little strange. Then we couldn't find bin Laden. Now that might be reasonable. A man that could mastermind such a vicious and human attack might be capable of hiding. But what bothers me about our lack of finding bin Laden is bin Laden would periodically release video. I mean, bin Laden has out more videos than Jay-Z.
Just released a new one, right?
What? So what bothers me is how could the video man and distributors get to bin Laden, and we couldn't get to bin Laden. And here we are still running our cable, and still putting out videos. Just put out this fall video last week. Something strange about that. So in that suspicion, I guess many are saying, let's be sure what we're talking about in Iran, and let's be sure what we're talking about in Afghanistan. Now that does not make us weak. I think that clearly we must defend America. I think we must defend American lives. But I think that we must defend America against real threats, not perceived and imagined threats. And I think the most unpatriotic thing one can do is to risk and lose American military lives on flawed or false intelligence. Yeah. And when you look at the lives of Americans and Iraqis that were lost on a lie in Iraq, I think it is an embarrassment and a shame to this country, and something that we should take as a lesson going forward. I think that President Obama is right to engage different parts of the world that has not been engaged. I thought it was a great thing for him to sit as a sitting president and preside over the Security Council and to challenge them to become our partners and not to stand back and feel we're going to make unilateral decisions and unilateral policies. But at the same time, I think that we must be sure-footed before we go into any military engagement. On a domestic level, a couple of things are raging. One, I'll take the one that I'm more directly involved in. In May of this year was the 55th anniversary of the Brown versus the Board of Education decision, which effectively got the Supreme Court for the first time to deal with the question of segregation by race in public schools. 55 years later, the achievement gap between black and Latino students and white students is almost as the same gap as it was in 55. For all of this talk of we're in a post-racial generation, the fact of the matter is that according to the Department of Education of the United States government, under Bush, black and Latino students are on an average 4 grades behind in reading and in mathematics and basic skills than their white counterparts. Now, that is a frightening statistic. To add to it, blacks are doubly dropping out of school. What bothers me is that given this critical situation, look at the city of Detroit, where 2/3 of black men are dropouts. How can you survive in a technological age without even a high school diploma? Now, there was a time you could get by and try and do other work without a high school diploma. It is almost impossible to do any kind of work given the technology without some college education, if not a degree. Yet we are graduating only a fraction of a generation in the black community. So I began to raise the issue of why weren't those that were my colleagues in civil rights, why wasn't those in politics raising this egregious issue? Ironically, some of the answers united strange bedfellows. One of the things that came back was, well, you can't do much about the educational problems unless you're going to deal with the fact that administrators and teachers cannot lose their jobs or be held accountable. Well, that doesn't make sense to me. Now, I'm for unions. I'm for union protection. But no worker should be in a position where they're not accountable for their work. You can't have schools that don't work and say the principal is protected. Well, who's going to protect the students? You can't have classrooms where the students are failing in math and no one has the right to judge the performance of the teacher. So as we raise these issues, and President Obama ran on this, that he was going to deal with this, ironically, some on the right agreed. And we ended up on a May meeting in the President's office with the Secretary of Education, Arnie Duncan, with former House Speaker Newt Gingrich and myself, and said that we need to go around the country in a bipartisan